tonight we'll begin studying some apologists like Justin Martyr, Aristedes, who we'll study tonight, and Athenagoras of Athens. So did you get a chance to read Aristedes?
I thought it was good. He made a. I got a little tired of reading about the Greek gods, but it's kind of like reading a Russian novel. Not as bad, but anyway, I thought it was really good. He made a great. He presented his case well, I thought. And the thing that struck me about it was just how God works. Just the development of not theory, but the philosophy, just the kind of evolution of and solidification of the faith and understanding of it. And the thing that came to mind too is I don't know where it's from. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. That through his example of talking about the barbarians and the Greeks and the Egyptians and Jews ever coming forward, God was, in a sense, preparing the people for the light of the world. Each of those groups kind of developed a little bit more. The barbarians and Greeks and Egyptians weren't the greatest, but the Jews, of course, were a bedrock, and then the Christians. I thought that came to mind as I was reading it. Just the way God works in history, salvation history, preparing the people, subtle ways.
Yeah. People in darkness have seen a great light comes from Isaiah. And
Oh, it's Isaiah.
Quoted as a fulfillment quotation in
Okay.
Matthew.
Yeah, that makes sense.
His kind of argument of partial revelation is, sort of an interesting one, since it was in many ways rejected in, part of the church, and part of the church's history, where Catholicism is the only expression of the faith. And then that position was reversed in Vatican II, where all faith traditions contain some degree of revelation of God. So in many ways, yeah, I mean, that was an interesting and important point that Athenagoras makes. Let's start with sort of the some background about apologetics and apology. It comes from the Greek word apologia, which means speaking in defense, or apologos, which is a speech in defense. And so the first apology is Plato's defense of Socrates, or literal translation is apology of Socrates. So the English usage followed the original Greek, and then in the 16th century, a parallel meaning of an expression of regret emerged. There's also a sense of apologetics as being a defense, almost in the sense of simply rebutting arguments, whether what's being rebutted is truthful or not, and what's being argued is truthful or not. So apologetics becomes, in essence, defense at all costs. And in many ways, that's that. John Henry Newman's Apologia Prophetia Sua restored the original meaning of apologetics if anyone has read it, it's a defense of his life and his faith and his um, return to Catholicism in the midst of enormous criticism, both as when he was an Anglican, he was a leader of the Oxford movement, which had as its goal, sort of growing an increasingly close relationship with Catholicism, and that was heavily attacked. And then he was heavily attacked for conversion to Catholicism. But often apologetics in the modern world is, sort of a defense at all costs. So a while ago, I read a book called 10 Lies About Catholic History, I think it was called. And so one of the chapters is on how the Dark Ages weren't dark, which is generally acknowledged by all historians. So there was no real news there. Peculiar that that chapter would even be included, since it sort of had general knowledge. And then there was like a defense of the Reformation, not the Reformation, a defense of the Inquisition. There were a number of chapters really defending what was largely the indefensible. And what was striking to me in the Inquisition is that the argument was that the church was being subject to the church's Inquisition was not as strict, catastrophic as being subject to the state's Inquisition. And so then the argument becomes that the church is a little bit better. But that's a completely morally bankrupt argument. As followers of Christ, we're not called to be a little bit better or a little bit less evil. We're called to renounce evil.
Yeah.
And so you see that kind of argument in apologetics, all the time. It's a little bit, it's not quite as bad, or we're a little bit better. And so that, is in many ways, I think, really problematic and gives apologetics a bad name. That shift in apologetics, in many ways, occurred partly with the Reformation. It did occur with the Reformation, but it also really very sharply occurred after the French Revolution, when the church really, church's initial response was to defend the rights of kings. The church was very opposed to the notion of human rights. The church was, really concerned with restoring the ancien regime, which it attempted to do in the period after the defeat of Napoleon and in the Restoration, and failed dramatically. And so today I think we see apologetics as sort of a mixed bag. Apology ends up being sort of an apology for racism, an apology for genocide, an explanation for why these things are good when they're not good at all. And at the same time, there are also some really good apologists still writing. So, Athenagoras, what's striking is that for the most part, and he mentions the writings, Christian writings. He uses the word gospel once, but predominantly he's not really concerned with theology to a great degree. So did anyone sort of catch the central assumption underlying his work?
He was a little high and mighty in a way.
Yeah, he was a little high and mighty in a way.
He was very critical, especially when he got to I think it was the Egyptians, as bad, I think something along the lines of as bad as the Greeks were with the gods. My goodness, how much worse were the Egyptians with their making gods of plants and animals and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Why might he have done that?
Oh, to correct any error, perhaps. Oh, well, if you go back to the Old Testament, right, with the making of idols and
Yeah. Well, if you notice that his attack on the Egyptians is really in many ways kind of an interruption. He's criticizing Greek religion. He then throws in the Egyptians, and then
right,
he returns to Greek religion and Greek poets and Greek philosophers and their conception of the gods again. So the Egyptians are kind of right stuck in the middle, almost, as really as an interruption.
Yeah.
So,
why would he do that?
well,
That's what you're asking.
yeah, why would he do that? Any ideas of why he would do that?
Well, it's an odd way to defend the faith. He was talking about their gods, the Egyptians' gods were eaten and destroyed by men and burned. It's like, what does that mean? That people are getting rid of them? It was kind of confusing. Like
Page,
gods did not suffice them.
page
Put the name
40.
of the gods on beasts that were merely soulless. For some among them worship the sheep, and others the calf, others the pig, others the shellfish. The Egyptians do not understand that the like of these are not gods, since their salvation is not within their own power. And if they are too weak for their own salvation, then as regards the salvation of their worshippers, pray, whence will they have the power to help them?
Right.
With any god, So talking about things that are alive instead of just the statues and the other types of things that they worshiped.
He repeated that
Mm-hmm.
that theme throughout, talking
Yeah.
about all the gods.
Mhm.
They were so flawed, and they couldn't even help themselves. How could they help anybody else?
Right.
Right,
But the Egyptians
right.
are the worst on earth.
Any ideas of why he inserted the Egyptians? Because he really ridicules them, right?
Yeah. Let's read through again real quick.
Okay, so then he's defending God in this.
Right. So remember that this is a letter document to be presented to the emperor, and its goal is for uh, religious toleration so that Christians aren't persecuted, aren't slandered, and are accepted for their faith. And, so is that's a sensitive issue because there's a whole pantheon of the gods. There's a belief that the emperor also is a divinity. or is in some sense divine. So you just can't go bulldozing everything, sort of wholesale. You have to be a little bit careful. And so he criticizes the barbarians. He criticizes the Greeks, and that's basically the Greco-Roman tradition. And then he inserts the Egyptians, who become really an element of comic relief in the middle of the attack on the Greeks, to sort of diffuse the situation,
Yeah.
provide an element of humor. A Roman emperor, Greek emperor, first of all, I mean, the world is seen as being, there's the civilized world, which corresponds to the boundaries of the empire. And there's the barbaric world of barbarians, which is everything outside the bounds of the empire. And that barbaric world is dark and dangerous and undesirable and unpredictable and not very nice and not rational. And so, he has his critique of the barbarians, and then he has the critique of the Egyptians coming in the middle of the critique of the Greeks. And that's in many ways positively, almost funny.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so stupid that they've confused serpents for God. How dumb is that? And so, and then he returns to Greek religiosity, and then to Judaism, and then to Christianity. But in many ways, I mean, I think that this is a really well constructed and well thought out argument in which he tries to be persuasive and at the same time, really diffuse what can be an argument that can really push buttons.
Yeah.
And get a very hostile response. So I think he does a really good job of trying to diffuse that, trying to add for his audience what is an element of humor, and at the same time, sort of making a point. So I mean, I don't think that he in crafting his argument, I don't think he does anything particularly unethical or untruthful.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's all true. Yeah. And maybe he didn't want to incur the wrath of Hadrian, too. So it was a little comic relief inserted.
Yeah, either Hadrian or Antoninus. It appears that the top heading conflicts with the second heading, which is probably the original one. The second heading has it being a letter to Antoninus, and the top one has it to Hadrian. And underlying his critique of religion, of the religions, of the, I guess we could say, progressive revelation of God that underlies his division of religion into barbarian, Greek, Jewish, and Christian, is an assertion about the effect of God.
Mhm.
Did anyone catch that? Or the effect that the belief in a particular God has on people?
Well, yeah, it's kind of the beginnings of the writings of the creed, some of the statements. which is in that era.
Right. Yeah, there is a creedal
Mm-hmm.
formulation. But more generally, pagan gods, Jewish God, Christian God.
What's the gods that are alive versus the gods that aren't?
Mm-hmm.
Except for the animals and the Egyptians, but yeah. So there's the living gods.
Mm-hmm. If we even break down or ignore that difference, the living God versus dead gods, what what effect, what impact does God have? Does a real God have? Does a false God have? It makes no difference.
Well, it talks about Mary being the mother of Jesus.
Yeah,
So there's the divinity and the human aspects.
Oh, yeah, you're right. It does. Yeah, it's very reflective of the creed. Had the creed been formulated at that time, Ron, or not?
no, no. I
Oh,
mean, there are, a variety of early creedal statements,
sure.
um, and there are even some sort of creedal statements in Paul. I think there was a creedal statement in Didache. And creedal statements emerged very early and were really important as sort of summations of the faith. More generally, what underlying his argument that cuts across all of the religions he makes and so you notice that he doesn't really focus very much on theology. I mean, his creedal statement comes early and is almost out of place summary, because then it is said that God came down from heaven and from a Hebrew virgin took and clad himself with flesh. And in a daughter of man there dwelt the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
This Jesus then was born of the tribe of the Hebrews, and he had 12 disciples in order that a certain dispensation of his might be filled. He was pierced by the Jews, and he died and was buried. And they say that after 3 days he rose and ascended to heaven. And then these 12 disciples went forth into the known parts of the world and taught concerning his greatness with all humility and sobriety. Incidentally, that in many ways, as an aside, then these 12 disciples went forth into the known parts of the world. That's a significant statement that expresses the understanding of the church about Jesus' mission and the spread of the Gospels, so that today that's translated as uh, spread throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so this gospel will be spread throughout the world, and then the end will come. Is how the Olivet Discourse is frequently translated in Matthew's gospel. But that's an incorrect understanding. Paul had said that the gospel was spread throughout the world in his own time. And the word in Greek that's used in all of those instances is oikumene. There are three important words that always have to be, disambiguated. One is gay, which means the promised land. So in the book of Revelation, we often read about the world, and the word used is gay. It's not about the world at all. Then we have oikumene, which is the civilized world, which is to say the boundaries of the Roman Empire.
Mhm.
So Paul considered that the gospel had been spread throughout the civilized world because it had been spread throughout the boundaries of the Roman Empire. And so the Olivet Discourse, it's about the gospel being spread throughout the civilized world, not the world. The word for world is cosmos,
Mm.
as it is in English. And so when we confuse those things, we end up often, with a distorted sense, with a distorted understanding of the book of Revelation. We end up with, sort of uh, the gospel has to be spread throughout the world, including to all of those peoples who are remote and don't know anything about it. Like the people who evidently, the small tribe who evidently killed that one missionary who insisted that he had to spread the gospel to them, even though they were obviously not interested and viewed outsiders as hostile and threatening, as indeed their entire history would lead them to affirm the correctness of that position.
Mhm.
So he went in with no show of respect for a dying culture and paid the price. So very important to keep those things in mind. And Aristedes, correctly articulates the traditional understanding of the known parts of the world, the civilized world. So that creedal statement is, in many ways, almost out of place, or one of his rare mentions of theology. But if we look at his argument, what he argues is that the God that one worships, the conception of the God that one worships, influences those who worship him, her, or it. It influences morals, it influences ethics, it influences behavior. So if you worship gods who are murderous, then murder becomes a commonplace. If you, worship gods who are adulterous or who are devious, then adultery and deviousness becomes commonplace. It becomes acceptable because the gods set the standard. God or the gods set the standard for human behavior. So his argument then becomes that we imitate our gods or God.
Thanks for bringing that up. It should have jumped out, I guess, at us, or I should have picked up on that, I guess. I was maybe dismissive in my own way. We become what we worship,
Mm-hmm.
or we're kind of ignorant. I was thinking it was more like the barbarians and the Greeks, though. I mean, they were kind of advanced in their thinking and philosophy in a lot of ways, but with all those crazy gods, I don't know.
Right. He points to the paradox of, advanced philosophy and the arts, poetry, and yet the belief in these gods who are fundamentally flawed, fundamentally imperfect.
Mhm.
In many cases, gods who are helpless, gods who are murderous, gods who are devious, gods who are deceptive, gods who change form and appearance.
You could kind of look at it too as a excuse me, of salvation history with the entrance of original sin into the world and man being in darkness all these generations. Didn't have right thinking in the best ways.
Mm-hmm.
Something was clouded. The sin had clouded their understanding.
Mm-hmm. I don't know whether he's draws on it implicitly or is even aware of it or not, but a good thing to sort of keep in mind is um, Psalm 115, the beginning of Psalm 115. This is kind of can be seen as both a kind of an apologetic psalm. It in many ways is an apologetic psalm. But at the same time, it's a very
All right.
significant theological psalm, or a psalm with a very significant theological theme. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory for the sake of your mercy and your faithfulness. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel, feet, but do not walk. And they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them are like them. So are all who trust in them. And we can stop there. So here the notion is that the danger of idolatry is that those who make the idols and those who worship the idols become like the idols. And so we see the real, we tend to see idolatry as this kind of sin because it's pronounced to be sin. So it's one of the 10 Commandments, and that means, it shouldn't be broken and whatever. And we usually don't think about the reason for that. But the reason for it is that a thing that is lifeless takes over the, the, the human being who worships it. And, so we see that, and this whole problem of, we take on the behavior of the gods we worship. And we see that practically in everyday life. What happens to people who worship money? They exist for money. They're dead. It's all about money. Money is the totality of their being, of their person, of their existence. And there's nothing else. People live for their lawns. People live for their cars. Men live for their trophy wives, and trophy wives live for their rich husbands. There's nothing living there. There's only death. There's idolatry. A human being made in the image of God has been taken over. And then in our own time, the saddest thing is that happens to very many Christians who have been taken over by idols and have incorporated idolatry into their Christianity.
As
Right.
Luke says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will also be.
Right.
You see.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize that what heart means. It's not merely there's your attraction, or there's where your affection or where your love is. The heart represents the totality of one's being
Yeah.
in ancient Hebrew, in first century Hebrew thought. So it's not like our use of the word heart. It's that heart is the totality of one's being. So there is where your entire being is.
There's a phrase somewhere, Ron, out of the fullness of one's heart, one speaks, whether whether it's truth or for ill,
Mm-hmm. Right.
the true nature of the person.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's the very same, out of the fullness of the heart. Yeah, the same concept.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's, I think, a really powerful argument. What about, he begins by defining the existence and attributes of God.
Who says that God makes all things for the sake of man?
Right.
Earth, air, stars.
Yeah, that's
Everything.
a rather anthropocentric view, we would today say. And actually, a very common view that is found um, among many of the fathers, although one that is also rejected by many of the fathers. And for some, all things are made for the sake of mankind. For others, humankind is merely the top of a structured and ordered hierarchy, all of which points to God, all of which to varying degrees bear the divine image, and all of which is created to give glory to God. So, and in fact, that also comes very close to the Hebrew conception of the world, that people of God don't actually own anything. All belongs to God. But at the same time, a major corollary of his anthropocentric argument is that therefore we should fear God and not oppress man.
He asks not anything from anyone, but all ask from him.
That mover of the world, I comprehended that the world and all that is therein are moved by the impulse of another. And I understand that he that moves them is God, who is hidden in them and concealed from them. Does that sound familiar at all? It's Aquinas's first of 5 ways of the proof of God. Motion. Every object that moves is put into another object that is also in motion. Second object is put into motion by another object. And the sequence continues back into time. One must eventually come to something that began the whole chain of
Oh,
events, but itself does not move. That unmoved mover is God. So the unmoved mover, the one who puts things into motion but doesn't himself move.
That's part of an argument against the Big Bang Theory, an argument for the existence of God.
Yeah, although the Big Bang Theory is not an argument against the existence of God. In fact, the Big Bang Theory was first formulated by a Catholic physicist
Oh,
who was very much Catholic. And so, the question, I mean, and the same thing is true of Darwinism. I mean, the question here is, to what extent are we to understand the creation story in Genesis in a literal way, or to understand it in any way as being science, or are we to understand it as especially within its cultural context, as a story that looks to God as creator without really, sort of particularly providing a kind of nitty-gritty account of how God's creation unfolded. But, in many ways, telling us that that God's, so we have to contrast the creation story with the creation stories of surrounding cultures. And so since every culture, basically every early culture, had a creation story. So here in Genesis, there are 2 creation stories. So creation stories try to address either 1 or 2 questions. The first question is, how did we get here? And the second question is, why is everything such a mess? So the first creation story in Genesis addresses the first, and the second creation story addresses both. In the creation stories of the surrounding cultures, the world is created out of conflict. It's conflict between the gods that gives birth to the world it's born from. Strife and conflict. Life is born from strife and conflict. And so that provides kind of a simultaneously answer for how we got here and why is everything such a mess, because everything was created out of conflict and the gods are in conflict. So in contrast to that, we have Genesis. Creation is a orderly, structured, hierarchical process that proceeds from a loving God who pronounces all things good, so that the things that God created are intrinsically good. And then we have the second creation story, which deals with sin as derailing and diverting God's plan with destruction, with consequences, negative consequences that impact all of God's creation. So within the framework of that interpretation, something like the theory of evolution is, if we don't assume that Adam and Eve are literal, and even going back to the patristic tradition, many of the fathers didn't. Evolution provides a way in which God set in motion and helped along the creation of man. The Big Bang Theory really basically posits that from a small amount of matter, that matter expanded into a universe. But in all of those cases, the question is, how did life arise in the first place? And how did that small amount of matter arise in the first place and get expanded into something? And so we always end up, with the issue of the ultimate cause.
Right.
And so in many ways, I find it, I think, very liberating and very insightful. I mean, it helps us, I think, to focus on God. So, when we read much of the Bible in a really literal way, we kind of end up with the notion that we understand God, or that God is predictable, or in some ways that God is controlled. And that's a profound, I think, misconception, misunderstanding. God is incomprehensible. The ways of God are incomprehensible. How God works is incomprehensible. God transforms all things ultimately for good, including evil, by a process that we can't understand. We can only commit evil, and from our evil, no good inherently results. And yet God, from evil, ultimately creates good in a way we don't understand. So God is incomprehensible, God is infinite. And when we become literal in our understanding of the Bible, that gets lost. And we see that today with attempts to treat Genesis as a science textbook, which is really, I think, preposterous. We see, biblical literalism really run amok, especially with the rise of evangelical fundamentalism, where every word of the Bible is literally true, and there is no contradiction. Both of which are totally absurd propositions. The Bible is rife with contradiction, and not many words are literally true. As Catholics, there are only a handful of things we have to interpret as literally true. Although, evangelical fundamentalists interpret all of them as not literally true. But his attributes of God are, in some sense, important. Well, they're not. In some sense, important is the wrong phraseology. His attributes of God are extremely important because we're going to run into them again and again and again, not only as we read the apologists, but as we read many of the fathers, since they're all really foundational. So he has not born, not made, without beginning, and without end. That's very significant, and also it's mind-boggling, really. Perfect and incomprehensible, not in need of anything, but all living creatures stand in need of him. That's really very important. God is self-sufficient. Nameless, because that which has a name has been created. I am who I am. It's not a name. It's a statement of self-definition. No likeness, no form, not male or female, has no union of members. Unbounded, but imposes bounds on the heaven and the earth. Unbounded is a really important one. Without opposition, because none can stand against him. And Aristedes says, wrath and indignation he possesses not. And that's also a really important one. So we'll encounter these again and again and again. And so they're also really worth thinking about, in some ways, so not born, not made, without beginning and without end. You can't even say that God always existed, because the always assumes a beginning and a location in time. But God is wholly outside of time. And so we have, given that we live in time and in history, we have a very difficult time conceiving of that. And so that's a good thing to think about, because it's mind-boggling. Perfect and incomprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
Incomprehensible means that we can never fully comprehend God. And the tendency to do that is, very powerful, to comprehend God, to think we can comprehend God. Not in need of anything. That also means that God does not need us to wage a war for God, which
Good point.
a fact that's escaped very many throughout Christian history. No likeness, no form, not male or female. God is spirit. Unbounded, that's a really important one. We often see God as bounded.
Well, first of all, if you just take the Bible literally, and it's so confining. But God is so vast, and think of him as like the Hubble telescope. Just all these constellations and just, wow, just everywhere, beyond and beyond and beyond and beyond and beyond. God is.
Right. And the universe is still being created
Mhm.
as a really, really outstanding work on kind of the, I guess, confluence of science and aesthetics that partly, that in one part discusses that. It's by Thomas Dubé. He was a priest who died some years ago, but his book is called The Evidential Power of Beauty, and it's one of his books, but it really is sort of um, extremely powerful, and especially in his discussion of the expanding universe, that God is still creating the universe, it's still unfolding. The unbounded also, our Father who art in heaven. There's tons of patristic commentary about what Jesus means by who art in heaven. And so, we see that the usual view is that God is in this place in heaven. But all of the fathers point out that the problem is that the place in which one is located is greater than the one located in the place. So that can't actually be Jesus, that isn't actually Jesus' meaning. And so the argument is that he's really contrasting the fact that God is our Father, which is a close, intimate, personal, loving relationship. So God is personal, God is present, God is with us. In heaven, God is transcendent, God is other, God is not like us. And so we have this, sort of dichotomy, two sides of God. And so that's a really sort of good way of looking at this.
Yeah.
Next week is Justin Martyr.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah, then Melito of Sardis. Yeah. So next week, Justin Martyr.
Okay.
Okay.